Hello, can I please check if I'm audible?
Yes, loud and clear.
Excellent. Sorry, just give me a second to do something real quick. Okay, excellent. The burden of recovering from the economic crisis should not fall on the most vulnerable. Before I begin my substantives, let me just establish what this debate actually is about. As mentioned in the Ask channel, we think that this income threshold is normally a threshold at which people don't pay income taxes because they genuinely are just too poor, to the point whereby taking income taxes from them is morally unjust and cruel. So in the status quo, for instance, if you're under $500, earning under $500, the government literally looks at you and goes, "You're so poor, we don't want to take money from you. We will let you keep this money." Therefore, in times of economic crisis, we will raise it to a certain amount. This amount will be determined based on two factors. Number one, the rate of inflation in your country during the economic crisis. Number two, the extent to which economists believe that your marginal propensity to spend goes down. So this is a flexible amount that we can raise or not raise. But the debate is not about what this amount should be, but about whether we should raise it at all. Opposition has to defend absolutely no raising at all. Even if we defend raising it by like a couple of dollars, we still fulfill our burden. First argument, therefore, on why these individuals principally deserve this exemption. Note that in the status quo, individuals get exemptions because you recognize that they are vulnerable. This means that the state has recognized below a certain point, it has failed you. It recognizes that at some point, your more proximate moral obligations to your family supersedes your moral obligations to the state. And therefore, you need to be able to spend money to ensure that you are okay as a person rather than giving money to the state as well. They recognize that taking money from you causes an active harm to your person because any money that you lose is already the point at which you are no longer able to provide for your own family, etc. Why then does this group or this threshold rise in times of crisis? It is pretty simple. Inflation rises in times of crisis. What $500 used to buy and allow individuals to survive on no longer allows individuals to survive, the point at which economic crisis occurs and inflation eats away at those $500. But it's more than that, right? It's also the fact that unemployment rises, meaning individuals need savings just in case their jobs collapse because economic unemployment rises. This means then that what used to be enough to feed a family is no longer enough to feed a family or even your own person at that point. You can no longer afford groceries, no longer afford to put food on the table, ensure your rent is met. All of these things are things that hurt individuals, and the point at which the state places the burden on them to help economic recovery is the point at which they're no longer able to fulfill these things. Note, this principal argument supersedes everything Ob is probably going to say about economic recovery, because the point at which you're hurting the most vulnerable, even if it helps the economic recovery of the nation, it is an immoral act that the government is engaging in and should not be done. But I'm going to move on to why this actually is better for economic recovery as well. My second argument is why these exemptions help mitigate economic crisis. The first tier under this is that oftentimes, individuals who are poor or who are within the extremely poor class are individuals who are also in extremely high levels of debt. This is because they cannot afford the basic necessities of living within a 21st century without taking on debt in the status quo because wages have stagnated en masse. This looks like them taking on loans for their houses, their cars, their educations, and the school debts as well. All of this then means the point at which they are continually having to pay income tax on a marginally decreasing value of currency. This means then that they are largely going to default on their loans. What this means then is banks lose large amounts of money, the point at which they no longer get a steady stream of revenue from loans. But it's more pernicious than that. Mortgage-backed securities become no longer attractive. So in the status quo, banks package loans as investment items and then sell them off to be able to get more money to be able to afford to give away more loans. When individuals default, these investment opportunities are worth jack. What this means then is banks no longer get money from being able to get income from these loans. They are unable to give away further loans. They have to raise their interest rates and are unable because they just can't give away as many loans as a result. What this means is banks are which were before a crucial source of economic stimulus, because if you want to start or maintain a business and get capital to continue doing important economic activity, you used to defer to a bank and get loans from them in order to start up a business or continue operating your business. Banks no longer able to do this function at the point at which they have no money. This, in more pernicious instances, this can even result in a bank run, where banks are losing so much money and bleeding so much money that individuals are no longer confident in them and begin withdrawing money from this. This is exactly what happened in COVID-19, when inflation ran rampant around the world and banks began to default and are unable to give away loans because individuals cannot pay their rent and pay their dues and pay their debts, the point in which this economic crisis occurs. The point in which we give them this money, they're able to make that economic activity, prevent all of these harms from occurring. Second tier under this is that these economically dire people are ones who have the largest marginal propensity to spend. This means that they are like the ones who are most likely to spend this money and stimulate economic recovery. Anything opposition is going to say about how the government uses this money inevitably result in them using it in some form of stimulus package, that whereby they give it to some company or some individual. We do the exact same thing because effectively this tax exemption is just a stimulus package to the most vulnerable. Why then will these individuals stimulate the economy really well? These are individuals who are least likely to save their money because they have necessities that they have to feed, they have a family to feed, as I established earlier. This means that they are likely to vote with their dollar and spend that money in the most competitive companies within the state. This means the most efficient ones, because these are the ones who can afford to offer the best goods at the lowest prices. This means then that states are able to ensure economic recovery in the best possible way, because that money goes towards the companies which are the most efficient companies, the best companies within your state, which are delivering the most necessary goods to your poorest as well. On opposition bench, states are famously bad at identifying this because they just don't have perfect information. They don't have accumulated knowledge of every single working class people in the state that are unable to do this. Sure.
So your logic is poorer people have more marginal propensity to consume and therefore will stimulate the economy more. That argument only works if you think our counterfactual is like handouts to rich people and not the unemployed.
Well, number one, like on our side of the house, we can also continue doing these things as well, but we can also continue getting money to get these handouts to the unemployed from the richest of the rich. Like we can tax, like on our side of the house, we can equally raise taxes on billionaires, we can raise the capital gain tax, we can raise tax companies. These are all sorts of revenue that the state can have as well. Third tier under this then is why this leads to the social harms. The problem here is the point at which individuals default on their debt and are unable to meet their basic needs. They end up having property seized by banks. Like literally your home gets seized by a bank. The point at which you're unable to pay off the mortgage, because that's literally the incentive that banks have to take your stuff, because that's what banks want and that's in the contract. But beyond that, when these individuals don't have their basic needs met, they have to resort to worse ways to get money in order to be able to ensure the families are fed. This looks like, for example, crime. This looks like higher tendencies to go out and mug people on the street. When individuals are homeless and committing crime, this represents a massive tax drain on the state, because states now have to fund bills for their healthcare, the point at which they are freezing to death on the street because they no longer have a home with heating. The point at which states have to investigate crime, and the point at which businesses don't want to set up and operate because they might be mugged by individuals, is the point at which states are unable to ensure that these individuals are protected. Under all of these metrics, therefore, opposition bench worsens the economic crisis. They propagate crime, they propagate individuals losing their homes, they propagate banks being unable to function, they propagate individuals not getting the best stimulus packages out there to the country. So proud to propose. Thank you.
Thank you for the great remark. I'd like to call upon a leader of oppositions to continue their case. See here.
Cool. Oh, I should. Oh, geez. There we go. Okay. 3 points of a setup which will immediately convert the vast majority of that first affirmative speech into side negative material. Let's start by explaining what their policy actually does. They want to raise the minimum tax bracket, which means that for everybody above that minimum tax bracket, they are now no longer taxed on the marginal change in increase of the limit that side affirmative wants to defend. That is to say, if the original limit is $500 and they want to raise it to $1,000, for every single person who earns over $1,000, they are no longer taxed on the amount of income they earn in that band between 500 to 1,000, which means that this is a policy which obviously does not fulfill their principled responsibility to the most vulnerable people, because they reduce the amount of taxation being incurred from the wealthiest set of individuals in this debate, as opposed to the poorest people we defend under our side. I'll also point out that the principle they levy in this debate is mechanistically imprecise, because it relies on a characterization of inflation, which is not something which is occurring in a recession, a deflationary effect. Secondly, what is our policy instead? We would much rather engage in targeted forms of spending towards the most vulnerable sets of individuals. That looks like, for instance, giving subsidies to unemployed people or increasing welfare. Alternatively, on the supply side, we'd also like to provide industry investment grants in targeted ways that do things like encourage spending and do things like encourage construction projects. These are the sorts of actions that meaningfully encourage loans because you enable the poorest people to actually be able to do things like have faith and engage in businesses, provide money to the banks, and avoid the bank runs and worst impacts this team cares about. Finally, why is there a limited amount of money and why we can't, as First Affirmative suggests, just do both policies? Firstly, obviously, that's just kind of a rule of debating. Both teams get a relatively equal amount of fiat. But secondly, obviously, their team's policy is reducing the amount of tax liability being paid to the government, which means they're actually reducing the amount of resources the government has. And additionally, we'll also point out that debt and the cost of debt is particularly high in a recession, which makes any marginal changes in the amount of spending either team gets relatively difficult to promote. The conclusion of all of this is their team's policy distributes money amongst the wealthier echelons of society, while our team's policy of welfare and direct grants distributes wealth amongst the poorest regions of society, which is a clear explanation for why we deeply, deeply harm this team's ability to stand by their own principle. Why do we think helping the most vulnerable people then is something which is particularly critical in this debate? I'll take a point of information now.
So there's absolutely no reason why we cannot, while decreasing taxes on the poorest, also raise taxes on the upper middle class, billionaires, capital gains tax. These are all simultaneous things that we can do. So why exactly is it that we have to make sure that this tax exemption impacts everyone above $1,000 rather than everyone between 500 and 1,000?
Well, that's mostly because your team's policy is something which takes fiat away from the debate, and that means we get to counterprop things. Alternatively, I think this is an imprecise understanding about the way political popularity works with taxation. For instance, yes, maybe reducing taxes on the poor is a popular action, but I would contend that raising taxes on the rich is something which is deeply, deeply unpopular, which is why it's overwhelmingly not severely happened in most countries around the world. Let's look then at why helping the most vulnerable people is something which is so critical. Fortunately, this is mostly material that First Affirmative already provides for us, but we obviously help these people far more because firstly, we can give them money directly. Secondly, we can create jobs through the supply side measures we want to promote. And we would suggest that governments typically choose projects in times of recession with high labor costs for the specific reason of trying to avoid that recession and trying to improve the amount of spending in the economy. For instance, hiring lots of union workers. The impact of this is obviously that we just help that most vulnerable set of individuals that side Affirmative so cares about. I won't repeat their own impacting. Let's look at the second part of this debate, which is just to explain why our team gets far more efficient modes of spending under our side of the house. The first thing to observe is that when we provide money to that poorer set of individuals, we actually get a far greater multiplier effect of spending. And that's for three reasons. The first, as conceded by First Affirmative, is that when you target poorer people, they're actually much more likely to spend that money in effective ways because they have a higher marginal propensity to consume. They're less able to save because this is a set of individuals who are likely living paycheck to paycheck or are unemployed. They're reliant on basic goods and need to spend their money on things like foods and electricity and essentials rather than being able to either save up that amount of money or do things like buy luxury goods, which is inefficient because it's not as labor intensive. Luxury goods typically face things like markups that come from brand names and associations, etc. We'd much prefer there to be a far greater amount of spending in this debate. Secondly, we think we can also just give out money under our side of the house in a way which necessitates consumption rather than relying on the whims of the taxpayer. That looks like, for example, introducing measures like childcare vouchers or food vouchers in times of recession. Thirdly, we can also just engage in direct spending as the government because we keep the increased tax revenue that this team decides to forego, which means we can actually provide direct provisions for construction companies and other businesses to engage in infrastructure processes. Why does this enable us to have a particularly large multiplier effect, and why is that so good? If, for instance, the $500 we get from this tax passes from a construction worker to a construction company to a laborer to a grocery shop to a cashier to a water company, that $500 has moved around the economy in a way which has delivered benefits to 5 different people, as opposed to this team who relegates the impact impact of that tax only onto the one person. This means that we get a much more effective use of that money under our side of the house, clearly something which is substantially more preferable. In addition, though, we'll contend that when you stimulate the demand side of things, when you stimulate the supply side of things, you are far more able to encourage business confidence when you allow companies to understand that they're going to meaningfully be supported by the government, that when there is opportunity in the space to do things like engage in those large projects and to alleviate the worst impacts of that recession. Why then is that so critical? Firstly, obviously, we just get out of the crisis faster. When we give money to individuals with a higher propensity to spend, that encourages economic growth and activity, which prevents the worst impacts of the recession. But secondly, we also get long-term benefits under our side, because rather than leaving that spending to the whim of the taxpayer, we under our side of the house get to directly invest that material into infrastructure projects that bring long-term benefits to individuals, as well as fixing the labor market. Why then, thirdly, does this policy also increase long-term distortionate effects on the tax system? We will contend that tax increases are generally politically unpopular, but in addition, they often have unpredictable second and third order effects, which make it hard to predict what's going to happen at the point at which you increase them, how individuals are going to spend. And the bar for what is and isn't a crisis can often be relatively unclear, which means that it's really hard to drum up the political goodwill to reverse the changes this side affirmative team wants to defend, because this is such an unpopular policy and it will be perceived as increasing taxes. Why is this so bad? Firstly, it just makes it hard to re-raise taxes, which are really critical for doing things like encouraging social services and providing welfare to the most vulnerable people this affirmative team cares about. And secondly, insofar as you do lower the taxes, we explain that it's much harder to recover from that recession. For all these reasons, we fulfilled the burden of this affirmative team far better than they can ever claim to. So proud to negate.
Thank you for the great remark. I'd like to call upon the Deputy Prime Minister to continue their case. See here.
I want to make two clarifications at the top of my speech. The first is that the groups of people that we are now providing tax exemption to are by no means wealthy or elite individuals that are privileged. If you are earning $1,000 in Singapore right now, you probably qualify for personal income tax, but you are by no means someone that is living a comfortable life. You probably struggle to live from paycheck to paycheck, especially in a situation of a global recession where wages are cut and where there is an increase in things like the cost of transportation and groceries. The second thing I want to outline is the counter model provided by this opposition team, because they say they want to have unemployment benefits. The first thing I want to question is whether they have enough money to provide all of these very substantial unemployment benefits, as well as massive government infrastructural spending. Because if you think about it, the amount of money we are collecting from each individual is not a lot to the government. Because if you earn only $1,000 and then you are taking 20 or 30% from it, that is $200 or $300 the government is getting. Even if you multiply that by the millions of people in the income bracket, like $100 million to the government is not enough to like engage in massive infrastructural projects that will somehow spearhead the development of the country. So again, it's not as if they're able to get all of this massive infrastructural progress. And if they wanted those massive infrastructural progress, they had to forsake the unemployment benefits that they get. The pool of money here is not infinite. If they're going to spend on both, we posit to you that the unemployment benefits are going to be unsatisfactory and insufficient, and the infrastructural projects on their side of the house are also not going to be done to a sufficient level. But I just want to more directly respond to this claim about the counterfactual of unemployment benefits. The first thing to observe, and I know this is a bit frustrating, is that the fiat is not symmetric. It is popular to exempt people from taxes because people are generally averse to paying taxes. But unemployment benefits are unpopular because they are perceived as a strain on state resources, and they're perceived as going towards people that are unproductive. So there is not similar political capital for our policy to push for unemployment benefits. The second observation to make is that the government's primary incentive is to recover from the recession. This means that the ways that they will spend money is to push the economy out of the recession. This looks like quantitative easing that primarily benefits financial institutions because you're buying back government bonds that are held on their balance sheets. This looks like monetary stimulus that's not targeted
towards the most vulnerable, but rather targeted towards all income groups, including the middle class and the upper middle class. And the thing here is that the psychology of a middle class or an upper middle class person during a times of economic recession is to save, because they're trying to hedge against things getting worse in the future. So if their side of the house spends on monetary stimulus towards the middle income bracket, this means that those individuals are going to put their money in banks, they're going to put their money in investment vehicles, and it does not trickle back into the economy on their side. They do not have the fiat to specifically outline the ways in which governments will spend tax revenue. They have to follow the ways in which governments typically spend tax revenue to try to escape from an economic recession. We have commonly seen that what governments do in a time of economic recession is to spend on things like monetary stimulus. But then they said that, well, you can spend on targeted things like investments in specific industries. This looks an awful lot like the corporate bailouts we see during the periods of COVID-19, where specific large companies can lobby for governments to spend on them. And note, this doesn't increase wages or it doesn't increase things like employment, because what corporations do with the bailouts that they get from the government is to just spend more on their managers and their CEOs. Again, this is an awfully unproductive way to spend the taxpayers' revenue. But the last thing I want to say as the most direct response is that it's often incredibly difficult to qualify for unemployment, because you must be unemployed for a certain number of months, and also you have to give proof that you're not earning any income whatsoever. Oftentimes, there's a high amount of political capital to scrutinize the individuals that are qualifying for unemployment benefits, because they want to ensure that you're not trying to steal money from the state by actually earning some money on the side. This means that if you are an individual that has had your wage cut, if you are an individual that works odd jobs in the gig economy, simply you would not qualify for unemployment benefits. Therefore, this explains why that the model simply does not work. Before I move on to the substantives, I'll take a POI, if there's one.
Yeah, so you're thinking about, well, this is a small amount of money, so you couldn't spend it on both. One, that just massively shrinks your own benefit. Two, it's economically incorrect. Broad-based taxes like this raise the vast majority of revenue. The idea of, I'll just tax the richest when we make money is a popular narrative. Actually not true. It's broad-based taxes like this that raise the substantial amount of revenue that the state gets.
So the first thing I want to point out is we're specifically targeting people who are in financial precarity now because of the economic recession. So it's unclear that this is a broad-based thing of collecting taxes from many individuals. But the second thing is, our case is isolated to the individual. That is to say, even though the $200, $300 might not mean much to the state in the grand scheme of things in terms of being able to build a massive infrastructure project, but it means a lot to the individual who now has less money to pay for things like groceries, transport, or of their student debt loans. The reason why we provide tax exemptions to lower income groups right now is because we acknowledge that they are financially vulnerable. And the 10 to 20% of money that we take away from their paychecks are things that make the huge difference for whether they can eat a meal the next day or not. In times of economic recessions, the groups of people who are financially vulnerable is now much larger. If you are someone struggling to make ends meet and barely having any savings from your paycheck, you are now going to struggle infinitely more because the cost of living increases and wages gets cut. The context of an economic recession is important because their claim is that deflation happens during an economic recession. But oftentimes, rampant inflation is what precipitates an economic recession. Look at how global spikes in energy prices increased operating costs for businesses, meaning that they had to retrench hundreds of workers to maintain profit margins, and given how they have to raise the cost of the products they sell in order to recover their profit margins. This means that people lose stable monthly income, and also shows that what often precipitates an economic recession is the initial huge amount of inflation because of energy prices and because companies have to increase their price of products in order to maintain profit margins to their shareholders. I want to explain why it's principally immoral to continue to tax such people. And the reason is because oftentimes inflation and economic recessions are product of state incompetence and governments poorly allocating resources. If you have failed the social contract to such people and left them in such a destitute state because of your financial mismanagement, again, it is immoral to take money from such people. The reason why this group is extremely vulnerable is because a lot of their monthly expenditure are fixed costs. Things like rent, utilities, student debt loans, or car loans or mortgages, things they cannot opt out of. If your monthly expenditure is fixed and your wage either is stagnating or is getting cut, this means now you have a lot less money to spend on things like groceries or transport or rent. Therefore, the $200 or $300 that you're forsaking because you still have to pay personal income tax is what literally makes the difference for whether you are able to pay a student debt loan that month or not. The outcomes here are significant because one individual defaulting on their loan ripples throughout the financial markets because it sends fear in the minds of all of these financial investors where debt is now perceived as something that's incredibly risky. We told you two distinct harms of this. The first is that it causes massive instability in financial institutions and banks. When you have a lot of debtors that are defaulting on their loans, this necessarily means that the bank is unable to give people back their deposits when they want, and these things precipitate bank runs. But the second thing is that the financial instruments are less attractive, which means that less financial institutions buy things like mortgage-backed securities, making it infinitely harder for you to get a loan for your house.
Thank you for the great remark. I'd like to call upon the Deputy Leader of Oppositions to continue their case here.
Right, can I be heard?
Yeah, loud and clear.
I can tell why Caven needed a clarification for this motion, because that speech really demonstrates he knows nothing about how taxation works. But before really getting into the meat of that, let's begin and defend our counter model, which is Caven's first critique is that well, you can't have both because you have a limited amount of money and you get some here, you get some there, and therefore unemployed people suffer at the very end. One very simple response is that it doesn't actually matter how this money is allocated in the first place, because if you have an infrastructure project which needs to hire people, that means unemployed people get a job and therefore get money. If they aren't able to have that, there are other side benefits as well, which is why both policies, doesn't matter how you distribute it, will always help unemployed people as opposed to a broader set of people, which the government team wants to help there. But a second observation then they go is that, well, you guys actually have less fiat than us because tax cuts are super popular, but under your side, what you call it, like unemployment benefits aren't super popular. But the thing you miss here is that unemployment benefits are unpopular in the vast majority of circumstances when times are okay because people recognize the economy is going well and people are able to get jobs and therefore have a bunch of negative stereotypes if you cannot. The difference here is that when a recession happens, many people on net lose their jobs. White collar workers lose their jobs. People feel a lot of empathy for these individuals because they probably know someone who has lost their jobs as well, which is why, broadly speaking, during the times of COVID-19, people were very pro the benefits given to unemployed people and the support given to them because they recognized that the people were suffering and there was no way they can have a job if there was a pandemic and people were locked down and they could no longer work at the cafe they used to. That is why it is different, because in context of economic recession, people are far more likely to be empathetic, and as a result, our capital is probably going to be symmetric on both sides. The third observation they make here is that they go, well, you have to prove your unemployment for a very long time, and therefore it's really, you can't get access to it. Yes, this happens in times of stability because the government doesn't want to waste any more money. In times of crisis, the government knows that people have lost their jobs. There are so many stats of people losing their jobs. So clearly, whenever these benefits get added, they're not like existing tax policies. This is a new tax policy, which gets passed to the government, and often you remove these restrictions so people are able to better access this money. Policymakers are not this silly. Clearly, they're able to make a policy better than this affirmative team is able to. But the second thing then is I'm going to deal with this principle here. Let's just be very clear. We satisfy the principle because our counter model also gives welfare to the most vulnerable people involved, and we also provide incentives for companies to build infrastructure and employ these people. Then team is actually what fails the people the most. And the explanation is incredibly simple. It was under their side, they reduced the tax burden for everyone. So put it simply, if the tax-free threshold is $5,000 and they've increased it to $10,000, it means everyone now no longer has to pay an additional $5,000 of tax. This therefore means the person who earns $100,000 no longer has to pay that extra $5,000 of tax as well. That is how this policy works. Caven's response then is they go, well, we insist we'll make a carve out. The rich still need to pay more and the poor still need to pay less. Well, one, obviously, if you're going to tax the rich more, it becomes very unpopular. So we get way more fiat under our side. But secondly, if you use the same amount of fiat to tax the rich, obviously, we can also do the same here. The meaningful difference, however, is that you still lose the $5,000 we would get because we don't increase the tax-free threshold, which is why your side is something which fundamentally still hurts vulnerable and still benefits the wrong group of people who you ought not benefit during times of crises. But before we move on there, let's just also talk about a bunch of economic misnomers this team tries to put forward to win this debate. The first is they go, well, we can raise taxes afterwards. That's all fine. That's really bad because you can lower tax if you raise afterwards. You're likely to get into another recession afterwards because it means that when you have a changing in tax burdens, people now save more and people do not spend as much as they did to get out of recession. So you're likely to get more economic instability and you create cycles here. The fourth thing, they say that, well, obviously in these instances, inflation is also really bad. Currently, energy crises, cost of living is really immoral to make people pay more. But the problem is recessions are often defined by lack of growth, which is when inflation is likely to be the absolute lowest. The second circumstance they talk about is cost push inflation. So when there is an issue in the supply side, and as a result, it raises prices. But one, that is incredibly rare compared to recessions on a whole. But also secondly, for all the crises they talk about, such as the energy crisis, the oil crisis, it did not cause a recession in any country around the world, which means this is a situation which simply did not exist. The most common recessions are the ones where inflation is very low. These are often demand pull. This is when demand pull inflation is the lowest, because when recessions happen, people lose their jobs. People are unlikely to spend because they're trying to save by their own analysis, which therefore means you're unlikely to get the cost of living crisis, which the theme talks about. Totally incorrect context and totally economically illiterate. The last thing that they claim here is this absurd proposition that for some reason but the current status quo makes poor people pay like 30% on their income. That is an absurd amount. No system of progressive income tax makes you pay 30% of tax on your income. Like, a progressive system means the poorest will pay like 10% and the richest people pay like 50%. Totally insane claim, which is why the principle simply does not stand. Look, at the end of this is a team which is unable to satisfy their own principle. We're a team which satisfies it better. And this is also a team you should not put into any government position where they have control over economic policy. Here why.
Our team pointed out the threshold effects of losing money leading to you causing crime or leading to you having your house defaulted on and being exposed to precarity and being a drain on the state for welfare, healthcare costs, etc. This implies that your side actually makes these individuals a drain on the state when giving them this extra $100 or something per month would have prevented them from draining that many resources from the state.
Yes, because they can buy stuff so they don't steal the bread anymore. I don't necessarily understand the POI. Seems like broadly symmetric. Moving on to the more practical issues in this debate. They next claim that a bank run is likely to happen because more people now default on their mortgages. Few responses. Firstly, plethora of alternative policies you can implement without being so broad, which is say, firstly, governments can secure deposits. Secondly, mortgage freezes can happen for a period of time. Thirdly, you can give people subsidies directly, which they can use to pay their mortgages as well, which is why you don't need this policy. But secondly, I also think a bank run is deeply unlikely to occur under your side because banks have to know that recessions are often cyclical. They often have significant amounts of reserves in times of crises when things like that occur. Things like minimum liquidity reserves, things like limits on the amount of leverage they can take out on a particular loan, means that banks are likely to still have confidence during times of crisis, and you're unlikely that people are taking out their money in order to take out the money and causing things like bank runs. The last claim they make here is this argument about efficiency and allowing people to access money so they can spend it. People who benefit under your side, as I said, are people who are most likely to save more, and therefore you do not get the benefits of a marginal propensity to spend. Kagan gives us the explanation himself by saying that these people are most uncertain about the future economic outset and as a result will not be spending. But you add some additional reason that these people also are people who are cognizant about retirement, about having money for their children to go to school and things like that. Suggest that this group of people will not be spending the money in which they get from your tax break compared to our side. But if you give them a direct subsidy, they're very likely to spend 100% of that subsidy, which means that our policy is a more economically efficient way in getting people out of recession there as well. Which therefore means at the end of the speech, the thing you had to believe is that this is a policy which is untargeted, it's too broad, it helps people who do not need to be helped in the times of recession. Our policy is far more targeted, and as a result, you ought to support it.
Thank you for the great remark. Out of the caught up on a government whip to continue their case. Here.
Camera?
Oh. Hi, can I be seen and heard?
Yes, loud and clear.
Okay, great. Give me 1 second. Recessions are usually driven by initially incredibly high rates of inflation. Things like supply-side shocks, for example. Think of the past major oil crises that we've experienced in the past several decades. Things like famines, lack of crops, etc., etc. And for these poor individuals, there's no forced to spend for their basic necessities, even if their money is worth more in the time of deflation. Because these are people who don't own their houses, need to keep paying for their loans because they probably took out a loan to pay for their education because they don't have that much capital or wealth to rely on. So these are people who still need to spend. That is the baseline that we are forwarding on our side of the house, and why it's principally unjust to take money away from them through the form of taxation during this period of time. Let's engage with the counterfactual in opposition. Explain why it just doesn't work to benefit the most vulnerable people that they want to benefit. Because they claim that a lot of our impacts are symmetric. Because they can increase welfare, they can give money to poor people, they can subsidize businesses, etc., etc. Why is this unlikely to happen? So I know they do get fiat. They can say that this is what they want to do, but they still have to prove why these are the likely manifestations of the counterfactual. I have several reasons why this is just not likely to be the case. One, they say that governments cannot do politically unpopular things. But note that super generous handouts, if they really do benefit the most vulnerable in a targeted way, are also incredibly unpopular. They say that, oh no, rich people can empathize with poor people because a lot of white collar workers also lose their jobs. But most white collar workers, most of them don't lose their jobs, and even the ones who do lose their jobs have savings to rely on. They don't understand what it's like to be afraid of losing your house. These are people who did not have to take out a loan for their education. They didn't have to take out a loan to buy for their house. These people have wealth to rely on. So even if they lose their jobs or are in an economically precarious situation, they won't understand why it's important to be super generous with handouts, and are still likely to be not like as empathetic if they believe that the taxes they're paying are now going to these poor people who are now getting a lot of money given to them. So basically, like, poor people are lazy kind of argument that these rich people are likely to experience. But on our side, tax exemptions are popular because everyone pays taxes. Even rich people know what it's like to be annoyed that the government has to take away their money. So this is likely to be a more politically counterfactual policy on our side as well. Second reason why their counterfactual fails. They see that governments on their side will do better things with the money. Things like investing in infrastructure, things like investing in targeted industries. So their rebuttal to our rebuttal was to say, well, the money will go to hiring construction workers. That is the least priority of governments. Governments are driven by lobbying. Governments are like basically big businesses. Companies can easily lobby for what industries get the priority of this money. And the money doesn't go to getting more construction workers to continue infrastructure projects. They go to the most valuable employees. They go to raising the money of CEOs to convince them to stay. They go to the executives and the board of directors to convince them not to leave. So the money doesn't immediately go to the most vulnerable if the money is in the hands of the government. But these taxes go to enriching the pocket, like to lining the pockets of people who are already rich because they're seen as the most valuable people in that industry. So the most vulnerable actually do not benefit on their side of the house. The third reason for why their counterfactual fails is that governments in status quo typically don't spend their money being super generous and giving incredibly great rates of unemployment benefits. They usually spend tax revenue on incredibly unproductive things, as already pointed out by Kevin and Ian. In status quo, governments often do things like bail out corporations, and governments aren't the best at identifying which corporations to bail out either, because governments are driven by lobbying. So which company appears to be the most important to the economy gets the priority, but these companies aren't the most who will hire more people. These are people who are likely to make sure that their employees stay by raising their salaries or ensuring that they just don't fail as a company, and therefore are unlikely to spend things on risky things like hiring more people. So they don't actually stimulate the economy on their side of the house. Or governments in status quo do things like give packages, but packages are usually dispersed to everyone and not the most vulnerable. So most of the middle class or the upper class will still likely to save and not stimulate the economy. Or the government will do things like quantitative easing where they buy back government bonds, but the money goes back to financial institutions and doesn't go back to individuals on the ground who are likely to spend their money. So I already explained to you with these responses that in status quo, the likely things that governments will do don't involve actually helping the most vulnerable, but rather in theory, their intentions could be to help the most vulnerable, but the way they are spent don't actually go to these individuals. Before I move on, POI.
Yeah, so we don't actually need to prove likelihood of our policy because this is a should debate. You guys get fiat, we also get fiat, so we get the policies we want. This whole 3 minutes was totally useless.
Yeah, I'd say this house would should do this debate, but the should do counterfactual are these things that I'm proving to you manifest in a harmful way. So the counterfactual they still end up having to defend to justify the should is still bad for people on the ground comparative to what we are defending. So they still are forced to engage with the burden. Moving on then, let's explain why they don't read the principle justification that we give to you. So they agree that the principle is important. They agree that people are vulnerable, that the state has failed them, and that they should be offered some kind of government offered some kind of support from the government. How come they do not benefit this vulnerable group of people more? This is the nuance of the principal justification you hear from Kevin and Ian. The argument coming from our side isn't that poor people are vulnerable, therefore poor people should get something. Our argument was that the act of taxation itself is immoral because you are taking money away from the most vulnerable. Because you acknowledge that, one, the state has failed. The state takes money away from you because the state promises you security. The state promises you certain benefits, that you can work in an economy where you have the freedom to choose the job you have. But in a time of crisis, the state has failed to provide these conditions, and therefore they shouldn't be able to take away your money through the act of taxation. But the second thing we pointed out to you is that the individual obligation to the state is weaker. You have a higher obligation to feeding yourself and your family over your obligation to the state as a citizen by paying taxes. And in this event, it is important that you no longer have to pay taxes to that degree. And this doesn't just apply to the poorest of the poor. Obviously, there is a bracket of individuals which we are able to measure through the amount of money they make, which therefore qualifies them for these instances. And for these reasons, we are able to prove to you that the principal justification is more important and inherent and is more directly fulfilled in the counterfactual on our side of the house. So even in our worst case, where side opposition does get to benefit poor people to some extent by giving them handouts or giving them welfare, they still, like, as the state failed on these individuals, it is much better and more justified to exempt them from taxes in the first place. So I want to be clear here. They might be able to provide handouts, but it's unclear whether these handouts remedy the initial harm that these individuals go through when you are taxing away their money, because this is the money, again, that they use to fulfill their most basic necessities. Another thing I want to point out with side opposition for why they don't win is because the idea of taxing the rich, which is their rebuttal, like, it's hard to tax the rich, and they later concede that they can also tax the rich. So let's just be charitable and assume this is symmetric, and you could probably tax the rich on either side of the house. The delta then that actually happens in this debate is that the way the money is used on our side is better for the economy and better for these individuals, because now we are less likely to drive individuals to the impacts Ian tells you, where these people are more desperate, likely to resort to crime, etc. But also the money is used to benefit the economy directly, as opposed to the government making bad decisions, which it already does in status quo and does, like, majority of the time in terms of how the money is spent during recessions. For these reasons, because we don't put the money in the hands of the government and more directly in the people, we are very proud to propose.
Thank you for the great remark. I'd like to call upon the opposition whip to continue their case. Here.
Hey, how's the audio?
Yeah, loud and clear.
This team's deeply cowardly because at no point do they defend this policy. What they defend is in general stimulus. And then we get a few minutes at the start of 2 and 3A being like, well, this is actually the only way you could have stimulus. I'm going to rebut that in a second, but it is a categorically insane argument that you should discredit in the absence of rebuttal. Like, as if, like, COVID stimulus payments weren't some of the most popular policies anywhere around the world, as if we haven't had enormous amounts of stimulus in the absence of raising tax brackets. So why do they say that the fiat is asymmetric? Well, they say, well, this policy is likely to be substantially more popular. First, I'd point out the fact that this is not the way that stimulus is usually done, usually our way is done, probably suggests that ours is more popular. Secondly, their mechanism that's a strain on the budget doesn't work. Tax breaks are also a strain on the budget. Third, you're literally giving out money. Almost nothing is more popular. Fourthly, businesses lobby for our form of spending. First, because they want more demand from consumers, so they're likely to want that to be spent. But secondly, because they want the direct grants. They want to get grants to do particular proposals. Fourthly, I note that this is particularly appealing under the status quo when you are in a recession. First, because it's no longer has attached the rhetoric of a moral failing, because you're not seen to have been unemployed because of your moral failing, you're seen to have done it because you've lost your job. And also now there are more unemployed people, so there is more political capital for it. Yeah, I'll take the POI.
So as a business, you're not sure if giving all the middle class people around the country a little bit more money will lead them to spend on your business. But you are sure that if you lobby the government to give your business massive subsidies, you'll immediately get that money without having to expend overhead costs to provide services in exchange for these subsidies.
Okay, so this is just the they'll do it in bad ways argument that you guys have been going on about. So first of all, we're not talking about subsidies to businesses. We're talking about giving them contracts to do things like build bridges. Those are conceptually different things. Secondly, we actually do have the fiat. Like, if NEG gets as much fiat as AF gets. AF gets fiat to specify the way in which the money would be spent, which means we get fiat of the same amount of specificity that the AF gets. So we do get the ability to do that. But secondly, I just note that the way we're describing is the empirical way that it's been done. Giving contracts to businesses to do things like build school halls, giving people who are unemployed money is the way that it has been done. And they say they're going to do it in the most effective way. Yeah, this way is effective because it gives money to the people with the highest marginal propensity to consume. So let's start by punting their principle. Their principle is, well, we need to help the most vulnerable. First, because inflation has increased prices. First, they help everyone, not the most vulnerable. Secondly, we help the most vulnerable more than them. And finally, their inflation explanation doesn't work because they're like, well, inflation might have precipitated the recession, which is like 1 in 100 recessions, right? Whereas most recessions are actually deflationary because when you have less money going around, there is less demand for goods and therefore prices come down. And also, if inflation has happened, that's not an argument for raising tax brackets in times of recession. That is an argument for doing what most states do and indexing tax brackets to inflation, not deciding to arbitrarily raise them during a recession. You just index them to inflation such that there isn't that bracket creep effect. That is not an argument for this particular motion. So that principle quite clearly out of the debate. Let's now talk about who gets money to the most vulnerable. So they say they help the most vulnerable. We point out we actually target people who are below this threshold rather than people who are above this threshold who are far more vulnerable. What do they say? The first thing they say is, well, you don't have enough information to know who is below this threshold. Yes, you do. You have fantastic information. It's tax data. Governments have unbelievably good tax data. Otherwise, how do they do your policy of having to raise the tax threshold and knowing who's there? Businesses have to report their tax data. The next thing they say is, well, no, they can also do it on their side because they'd raise taxes on the rich as well. Yeah, you can do it to some degree. The question is, what do we do with this pool of money that you have used in order to raise the tax threshold? We would say we would give that to poorer people instead. And if you can raise taxes on the rich, then given that that's beyond the fiat of the motion, then we can also claim that fiat and then use that money. But instead of using the money that you've taxed on the rich to give to the threshold, we'd use the money that you've taxed the rich to give to the poor. Clearly, there is a trade-off when you spend some money. The next thing they say is, well, subsidies don't go to the poorest workers. They go to the richest workers, for instance, the CEO. First, even if the CEO earns more than the regular worker, still the vast majority of labor costs in every business is going to be individual workers. But secondly, that's why governments, when they do this, look at the breakdown of the business to see what the labor costs are, to see what businesses have things like good union contracts that ensure that workers get fairly paid, and pick projects that have high labor costs as a component of total cost, such that you get good pass-through. Their final claim is it's hard to qualify for unemployment, perhaps in regular times. That's why these checks are given out differently, not through the standard unemployment system. Quite clearly, we help the most vulnerable more because they help people at or above the tax threshold. We help people below it by either 1, creating jobs so they can go from unemployed to employed, or 2, giving them direct money when they are below the tax-free threshold. Okay, let's now talk about who has the better economics, who's better for the economy. We point out, first of all, and completely no response at first negative, that the problem is when this team has to raise taxes again, that often creates a shock to the economy and people are scared about how businesses are going to react. That uncertainty often spins you back into a recession. Their lack of ability to respond to that, the claim that says they will never be able to get out because they will spin themselves back when they attempt to raise taxes again, automatically wins us the debate on this issue. They then say, well, the government won't spend it well. First, we have fiat. Secondly, the government cares a lot about the economy because it's the thing that they're primarily judged on in elections, so they probably will spend it well. Third, they have large bureaucracies with very smart people to provide them with good economic advice. But even if the government is bad and they misspend on our side, then they also misspend on their side. They probably raise the threshold by far too much and cripple the economy and be inefficient on their side as well. I want to know on the economy how much of their material is just totally uncomparative. All the stuff about banks and crime, we also get, right? Because we are also providing money to people that allows them to pay off their loans. And the person who lost their job is a lot more likely to default on their loan than the person who still has their job. The person who lost their job is far more likely to commit the crime. So all of those claims are totally uncomparative. They have only two actual claims on the economy. The first is this will function as corporate bailouts. First, I'd point out it's not a bailout, it's giving you a contract to do something like build a bridge. But secondly, I would say that helping corporations is good. First, you provide people with jobs. Secondly, you don't get economic contagion where one fails and then the next one fails and then the next one fails like dominoes. And third, the fact that you're helping corporations increases business confidence in general, which means that also you get more private investment on our side. And then they make the claim, well, the problem is it's the people at the tax threshold who are the ones who are most likely to struggle, but plainly untrue. Clearly, it's not the people who are at the tax threshold of income. For instance, in Australia, people earning $18,000 a year. It's the people who are earning nothing, or it's the people in part-time insecure work earning $10,000 a year that we help far more. The final thing they say is, well, we can't do both on our side. Well, obviously, if you don't have much money, then we don't have much money either. But if you're claiming a huge benefit, like if we only get $5 per person in unemployment benefits, then you only get a $5 tax break. The size of your impact is naturally linked to the size of our impact.
Thank you for the great remark. I was caught up on the upstream reply. Here.
This team is incapable of responding to times of crisis, and their policy is no good either. They fail to answer three key questions in this speech. Firstly, who helps the poorest people? And on this, they are totally unadaptive because they assert at first and second and third with literally no explanation that this is a policy which will help the poorest set of individuals. We explain to you down the bench the myriad reasons why this just isn't true. I explained to you at first negative that it's mathematically untrue. This policy clearly does not help unemployed people, for instance, but rather provides a tax cut to everyone who earns above the minimum tax threshold, which is an incredibly substantial proportion of the population. Kat explains that under our side of the house, we have so many counterfactual options, things like construction grants and infrastructure investments to give those people jobs and bring them a sense of economic solvency and fulfillment. And Matt explains that even if we do nothing else but provide welfare to the poorest sets of individuals, that is still the most efficient way of spending in a way which preserves the dignity of those peoples and grants them the rights. And the question I would just ask you is, like, genuinely, why is it the case that this team's policy would meaningfully help those most vulnerable people? When they run arguments around the importance of how some people are exposed to crime and some people might face bank runs and there's a principled justice behind the poorest people, ask yourself, why is it the case that they are so unwilling to defend those rights for unemployed people who are clearly far more vulnerable insofar as, by their own characterization, they are so poor the government can't even be fucked to tax them? That is a principle which is all the better fulfilled under our side of the house when we meaningfully redistribute the wealth to that poorest set of individuals. The second question you should ask yourself in this debate is who actually solves this recession? And fortunately for side negative, side affirmative explains that this question is a flow-on effect of the first question because they conveniently explain to us that for the poorest sets of individuals who have the highest propensity to engage in spending and the lowest propensity to engage in saving, that is the point at which you get substantial economic stimulus and encourage individuals to leave that recession. That obviously is something which is far better provided for under our side of the house when we target the poorest individuals who necessarily must spend in that way. But we also provide you with a variety of alternate mechanisms, none of which receive any response as to why we get better economic stimulus under our side of the house. I explained that we grant you tax flexibility because this is a policy that necessarily locks you in, something which Matt reiterates in his speech, receives no response from this affirmative team. Kat explains that we give people jobs and revitalize a dying labor market. The only contention that this team can say is to say, well, maybe it'll benefit CEOs somewhat. But personally, I would have liked to have the planes running during COVID-19, and they never explain why that's a bad thing. And Matt explains that welfare is actually something which is very important in these contexts because it grants people the ability to prevent the sorts of harmful behavior when they can do things like avoid crime by meaningfully buying food, when they can pay back their debts, who they are more likely to have, and therefore avoid those bank runs. Clearly, on the question of economic management, our team takes the win. The final question, unfortunately, that you must ask yourself in this debate is, can either team really do their policy? Because side affirmative's only real path of attack is to point their fingers in us and say, "Nuh-uh, you can't do that." Their claim is that the policy will not happen because it's unpopular and the government is a bad executioner. I will contend symmetrically that their policy will never work because it will be deeply unpopular amongst economists, none of whom will ever propose it. But even in the alternative, Matt explains to you that obviously it's the case that the executor of both of these policies is the government. And I reckon he does a pretty good job at explaining why that actor is quite likely to be good at the set of things we contend they want them to happen. At the end of the day, this team just fundamentally does not understand the motion, unfortunately, and I think ultimately that is a clear explanation that you need to take away from this debate.
Thank you for the great remark. I'd like to call upon a government reply to end the debate. Here.
First thing I want to do is to draw your attention to the motion, because the motion says would, which means that they have to prove that they have the fiat to actually pass all of these policies in government. We explain that the fiat is not symmetric because the political capital used to exempt taxation is not the same political capital used to provide unemployment benefits. The next thing I want to draw your attention to is the pool of money that we are working with. We are exempting poor people from tax, not middle class, not the rich, not the elite. We are exempting poor people. Right now, the threshold is very low and only captures the absolute poorest. We are expanding this bracket to people that are, yes, less poor, but still struggle to live paycheck to paycheck. If it is true that it is a progressive taxation system that only takes 10% or less from a paycheck of $1,000, it is unclear that the total money they collect is a lot to fund things like massive unemployment schemes and to fund things like massive infrastructural projects. I'm not sure why this opposition team is trying to pry the last $100 from the hands of poor people to contribute to a tax base that is already supported by the middle class, corporate tax, and the elite and wealthy. Even if there are 1 million poor people that we are exempting, which is a generous figure, and we take $100 from each of them, that is only $100 million they get, which is incredibly marginal compared to the billions of dollars they already have in taxation revenue. And also the trivial observation that welfare packages and infrastructural projects are in the billions. So even if you take $100 from every single person that only earns a $1,000 paycheck, they don't generate enough money to get any of the benefits that they want on their side of the house. There's insufficient money for the ambitious claims that this opposition wants for their immense infrastructure projects. Their economic theory here is that we will solve unemployment when construction firms hire construction workers. The question I want to ask is, do construction workers earn a lot of money? The answer is no. Construction workers struggle to live month to month. But these people that they claim they will generate jobs for, on their side of the house, end up having to pay 10 to 20% of their income and have to skip meals, sleep in the cold, and avoid seeing the doctor because the construction workers they generate jobs for are people that will have to pay personal income tax because the threshold right now is so low. All roads will lead back to our case because all of these harms of people suffering remain true even if they manage to generate jobs for these people. But I also want to point out that creating construction worker jobs doesn't magically solve the unemployment crisis because not everybody is physically fit to be able to work a construction worker job. Many of the elderly, many of the sick and disabled do not qualify and meet for those things. And this is the simple weighing for why we win. Opposition has a high burden of proof. In order to believe their claim, you must believe two things that they do not prove. The first is that you must believe that governments will spend this well, and the second thing is you must believe that this helps the economy escape the recession. If there is any doubt on either of these premises, none of the opposition case activates. And there is a lot of doubt that we pushed consistently down the bench. We explain that governments are captured and lobbied. We explain that governments have imperfect information. We explain that governments have to spend on a variety of other things. But the most trivial observation is that economic recessions are caused by exogenous factors. This means that even if you spend money in the most intelligent ways possible, things like COVID-19 or things like global energy prices because of the Russia-Ukraine war doesn't magically go away, so the economic recession will still stay. Given this, you will believe that the most important clash in this debate is about helping the poor. We explain that we help them directly by letting them keep that $100, $200 that can go to things like food, rent, or medicine. On their side, they take money from those poor people that earn only $1,000 a month. It goes through the system of bureaucracy of the government. It goes to other parts of the budget, and then a fraction of that trickles back to people, and those are the people that actually qualify for unemployment benefits. So even if they help the poorest people who are unemployed, they help them in a very roundabout way, because the only way they help them is by making the money from the poor and vulnerable people trickle through a bureaucratic system that somehow goes back to them. Do you know why this is true? The reason this is true is because they admit it themselves, because they want things like stimulus. Stimulus goes to every single person in society, not just the vulnerable. It also goes to middle class and upper class individuals. They want things like infrastructure investments, which again, they are using the money of the poor people who only earn $1,000 to $2,000 a month, and taking that money from them and use it to fund infrastructural projects. It's unclear why, even if infrastructural projects are good, why it should be financed by people that literally struggle to live paycheck to paycheck.
Yeah, thank you for the great remark and for the other speakers. So yeah, we'll think about